thanks for the invite. I'm going to talk about atom probe tomography and applications in oxidation and corrosion of metals. I am from Imperial College and talking to you from London at the moment. We are actually working on site most of the time right now, so it's quite nice to be able to get back into college. And most of you will know this, but at Imperial we have quite a large team of metallurgists working on engineering alloys. So there's myself, there's Baptiste Gault, who's an expert in atom probe, Ben Britton, David Dye, Min Son Pham, Fionn Dunn, Mark Wenman and Chris Gorley. So I have joined this team in 2018, and I've joined quite a strong metallurgy team. And there's a lot of expertise in advanced characterization and micromechanics as well. I said I would introduce myself, so this is a bit about me. I did my undergrad studying material science in Oxford, and then carried on to do a PhD and a postdoc there. My PhD was on aluminium alloys, producing new alloys through powder metallurgy and extrusion, and doing a lot of characterization. And then I joined the atom probe group in Oxford for 3 years, looking at advanced characterization, atom probe, and nuclear materials and a bit of corrosion. And then I joined the Rolls-Royce UTC in Cambridge, working for Howard Stone for almost 2 years. And in 2018, I came to Imperial as a lecturer and set up my own research group working on oxidation and corrosion. And last year, I was fortunate enough to get two research fellowships to develop my group and to develop the corrosion and oxidation capabilities at Imperial. So my fellowships, the project plan for them was a comprehensive view at corrosion and oxidation. So under oxidation, I want to use them to understand the role of specific elements in oxide formation and growth, and use that knowledge to figure out ways of engineering a more protective oxide scale, and also look at very early stages of oxidation, because they influence the later stages and they haven't been studied quite as much. Under corrosion, I want to try and replicate service damage in the lab. So I actually look at some ex-service components provided by a variety of industrial partners, and use those to sort of understand the role of specific elements on the corrosion behavior of the alloys, and then change the alloy compositions to suit the corrosion requirements. And then I want to look at coatings and contamination as well. So the coatings is understanding the role of specific alloy coatings and testing new coating compositions to see whether or not we can improve the corrosion resistance through targeted coating additions. And then contamination is adhesion of contaminants on the surface under different conditions. At Imperial, since I've joined, we already had alloy production facilities. So we have an arc melter and some characterization facility. So FIB, STEM, SIMS, FIB SIMS as well. We have some characterization facilities, and I used my fellowships to employ a postdoc who's building a corrosion fatigue testing rig. That's going to have 8 different inlets for different gases, so that we can corrode the samples under a variety of conditions. And then there's some very, very exciting news that we've been allowed to announce this week, which is EPSRC is funding our bid for an atom probe. And it wasn't just one bid for an atom probe, it was a cryogenic setup with a TEM, a plasma FIB, and an atom probe, and a cryogenic transfer system in between, and a cryogenic stage in the FIB and in the TEM. So that's very, very exciting. We have to get most things purchased and set up by April, but hopefully that will expand our capabilities for doing a lot of research in the next year. Atom probe tomography, some people are familiar with it, but until now it's been a bit more of a niche technique, I guess, because Oxford is the only place in the UK at the moment that has an atom probe. That is about to change, and we are going to work very, very closely with Oxford on our atom probe setup to the point where their group leader, Michael Moody, is very involved with the setup of our new atom probe. But if for those who don't know what atom probe does, we use a fib or electropolishing to make very sharp needles from our samples. And the needles have to be less than 100 nanometers in diameter at the tip. And then we pulse either a laser, so this is the laser pulse, or a voltage to induce field evaporation. So once we pulse the laser, any surface, anything that was on the surface would have, because the electric field here is so highly concentrated due to the sharpness of the needle, anything on the surface will field evaporate. And it's accelerated by a counter electrode and going towards a detector. So we know when we pulse the laser or the voltage, so we get an idea of the time of flight. And then from the time of flight, we can figure out the mass of the ion. And then from the location on the detector, we can figure out where it was in the tip to begin with. So what you end up with here is a 3D reconstruction, like the one in the corner. This is a silicon sample with a grain boundary and carbon on the grain boundary. And you end up with this 3D reconstruction of the location of individual atoms within the sample. This slide was kindly provided by Baptiste, who is our resident atom probe expert. I use the atom probes. He specializes in atom probe. I tend to use them as a means to an end, the end being the characterization of corrosion and oxidation of metals. But Baptiste specializes in atom probe and technique development as well. And yeah, so let's move on to how this is used for superalloy oxidation. This is one example that I'm going to be talking about. So this is a project that was published, that was run with Rolls-Royce, with Mark Hardy, looking at the partitioning of titanium and kinetic growth predictions on the thermally grown chromia on a nickel superalloy. So we started with the baseline alloy with some chromium, nickel, iron, no, not iron. And the oxides that were expected to form would have been nickel oxide, chromia, some titania, and some alumina. And we can kind of get an idea of where these oxides are going to form within the surface scale based on the partial pressure of oxygen that they require to form. But it's never that layered and black and white as the thermodynamic predictions would lead us to believe. And also, titanium has been shown to to thicken the oxide scale quite substantially and almost linearly. So with the addition of titanium, the oxide scale thickening it becomes worse and in almost a linear manner. And in this case, so after 100 hours at 800 degrees, on the samples we formed the oxides that we expected. So we formed some chromia on the surface. There is a scale here that's mostly chromia. There is some rutile, so titanium oxide on the surface. And there's a titanium enrichment at the oxide metal interface underneath as well. And then there are some alumina intrusions going on underneath. But this is based on SEM EDX. It can give us an idea of where these oxides are and what they are, but atom probe can really tell us the exact chemical composition of these oxides. So in this case, I picked up 2 needles from this sample, one from the very outer surface and one from the chromia scale. They're indicated with the red 1 and 2 on the image. And the top figure here is needle number 1. And it is made of titanium dioxide, principally, with a grain boundary at the top. So we have titanium and oxygen. Titanium is green, oxygen is blue. And this is a concentration profile going across the grain boundary here. I hope that people can see my cursor, because otherwise, can you see my cursor? I'm going to assume that you are seeing my cursor. Okay, so the titanium oxide, you can see the profile, and at the grain boundary, there's a slight depletion in oxygen and a slight increase in titanium content. And then in needle number 2, lower down into the oxide scale, this is chromia. So we got the composition of the chromia, and what is interesting is here, unlike the rutile, we have the oxygen, we have chromium as expected, but we also have some aluminium in solid solution and some nickel and some titanium as well. So it's quite interesting to get an idea of the exact chemical composition of the sample, because chromia is not really stoichiometric chromia in this case. And at the grain boundary, so a concentration profile going across this grain boundary will tell us that there is a depletion in oxygen, and there's an increase in titanium there as well. The depletion in oxygen, what it tells us is that in this case, the oxide scale is not growing through inwards diffusion of oxygen, it's growing through outwards diffusion of titanium. So we can see there is titanium oxide forming on the outer surface, and if we implement, and if we sort of use this information, we use the composition of the chromia scale. So we have some chromium, we have some aluminium, some nickel, and some titanium. If we assume that all of these metallic elements are substituting for the chromium on the chromium lattice sites, like this, we suddenly substitute titanium in there, the preferred valence of titanium is going to be different from chromium, and therefore there has to be a oxygen vacancy as well in order to keep charge neutrality. So in this case, we can figure out how many extra vacancies. Atom probe cannot see the actual vacancies because the algorithm tends to assume that the sample is solid, so it will not take into account the vacancies, but we can assume the number of vacancies based on the other elements in solid solution and figure out how much that will speed up diffusion. And that's exactly what we did. So if we have the oxide on the surface here on the left, the metal on the right, and with the grain boundaries, if there is titanium diffusing outwards at the grain boundaries, the prediction would be that this would cause the addition of 0.3 microns of rutile in 24 hours, which is more or less, this is as accurate as we observed. But without the grain boundaries, just looking at the number of extra vacancies and how much that would speed up diffusion, the conclusion was that this is basically impenetrable to more oxygen. So the diffusion would be that slow. It was not accurate removing the grain boundaries. So this is the kind of information that we can extract from atom probe that we wouldn't necessarily have from other characterization techniques. And we can apply the same thing to corrosion fatigue. So this is another study on corrosion fatigue of the same alloy, where 4 samples were tested under dwell fatigue conditions. So it was a 1-hour dwell, and samples were tested in air with SO2 and 3 gas, and air with SO2, 3 and salt. And then there was an extra interrupted test with air, SO2, 3 and salt, just to look at the primary crack tip instead of the secondaries. So what we found from this test is in air, this sample cracked at 45 degrees. So this is the tensile axis looking up into the slides. The sample cracked at 45 degrees. Once we added SO2 and 3, a mixture of the two, and this was done with a platinum catalyst to bring it to equilibrium between the two molecules. The fracture was now flat on the surface, so we can see that the mode of fracture has changed. And then adding salt, it's flat again, but there are 45-degree cracks and oxidized corroded cracks going all the way down into about 300-400 microns into the sample. And this crack, zooming into that one, this is what this picture is. We can see an oxidized secondary crack with a lot of different particles that have formed around it. Now, EBSD overlaid on top of this same image tells us that the crack has gone along the grain boundaries, and the secondary crack as well have gone along grain boundaries in this case. And EDX has given us a bit of an idea, but within all the limitations of doing EDX analysis on this, we can tell that in the crack there's a little bit of chromia that has formed. There's alumina that can go all the way around it. There is some titanium oxide, and the crack tip is oxidized. But if we're looking for the location of sulfur, there's a bit of a problem because sulfur overlaps with molybdenum, and it's quite hard to identify them unambiguously with just EDX. So this is where something like Atom Probe can really, really shine. So in this case, same crack, I decided to just pick it up and analyze it in the Atom Probe. So I made a cantilever out of this. So this is these are the sections of the crack that I wanted to analyze, highlighted in red. And I protected them with tungsten on the surface just to make sure that we didn't damage it with the ion beam, and then dug around it with the fib. So this is the Atom Probe sample preparation. We tend to just dig trenches around the area of interest with the fib. We pick up the same crack, and these are still the location markers of the oxidized crack. And this is the micromanipulator with which I picked up the crack tip and mounted it onto one of the Atom Probe supports. And then we just sort of cut sections off and attach them onto these supports that are a silicon coupon that's standard, made by the company that makes the Atom Probes. And we weld them on there and then sharpen them to less than 100 nanometers, as I've said before. This is what it looks like on the side. So we need something that will stick out from the surface. So we get these posts that are pre-etched onto the coupon by the company. So this is a standardized sample holder made on purpose so that the samples stick out and they can concentrate the electric field at the tip. And then I sharpened the samples. So as I said, they need to be less than 100 nanometers. So at this stage, I turned them into a sort of a donut shape. And the oxidized crack is in here. We can sort of see the oxide, and then sharpen them to less than 100 nanometers at the tip. So from this, I can get a very, very clear idea of exactly the section of the crack that I'm looking at. And in this case, from here, in the EDX, it looked like maybe a bit of chromia, but it was very hard to tell that there was anything else in there. In the Atom Probe, we can see chromia on one side, nickel chrome spinel on the other side. There was a bit of titanium oxide and a little bit of retained gamma phase in the oxide at the crack tip. So that's already quite interesting, showing that EDX can give you an indicator of what phases are forming where, but it's not really giving you the full picture. And then I picked up a few more samples out of that cantilever that I made before. So the first one was a bit more central down here, and then the second one I tried to pick up the crack tip, like the point where the oxide sort of goes in, it becomes grain boundary ahead of the crack right here. And I was able to pick that up. I didn't get a lot of data out of it, but enough to know that this is the oxide. We can see it in the needle, and when I sharpened it until I started seeing some of the darker particles at the grain boundary ahead, because I wanted to figure out what they were. And once it hit the first particle, the needle blew up. So I didn't really get the composition of the particles, but what I got is that the grain boundary is enriched in molybdenum, carbon, and oxygen. And there is a sort of gradient of molybdenum. So this side was the beginning of one of those particles at the grain boundary. And looking at a concentration profile going this way, we can see that the chromium is being rejected and the cobalt are being rejected into the alloy. And at the grain boundary, what we have is some molybdenum, some oxygen, and some carbon, and a nickel depletion there as well. So now I'm building a picture of what this all means at the crack tip. And then I wanted to take a second sample that was from the secondary crack. According to EDX, the secondary crack sort of looked mostly like alumina, and it was mostly alumina. So I got a sample from here that is alumina on one side and then going all the way into gamma prime. So there's an aluminium depleted zone and then gamma prime on the other side. And in this case, it's quite interesting because in most of the literature, the sulfur is reported to go at the alumina metal interface, and it's not there. The atom probe, like the EDX, could have been quite difficult to interpret because it overlaps with molybdenum. But in the atom probe, there wasn't any sulfur in the other two needles, and there is no sulfur at the alumina gamma prime interface either. There is some carbon segregation and a little bit of silicon impurities, but the sulfur didn't go there either. So atom probe has a lot of advantages. It's a fantastic mass spectroscopy technique. It's quantitative, and it's very, very accurate. Even ppm, we can detect trace elements very, very easily. It's fantastic for that. But it gives a very restricted field of view. So you have to do all of the background characterization first, figure out exactly where you need to look, and then you can go and look at that and get very accurate chemical composition. So at this stage, I kind of figured out that I needed to take a step back and look at a larger field of view in the same sort of crack here with SIMS. And in the SIMS, I figured out that actually the oxygen goes in the crack, the sulfur goes somewhat ahead and around the crack, and then the chlorine from the salt is within the crack as well. So the fact that the sulfur is primarily ahead and around the crack rather than within the crack explains why we can detect any of that with the atom probe. And this is a more zoomed in version. You can see that there's not really even a gradient of sulfur going from the crack. There's just these particles that have formed ahead and around the crack, but not it's not inside the primary the crack. I kind of needed to explain why. So I decided to go for TEM this time. The reason to go for TEM is we can get a broader field of view and a better idea of, so SIMS is fantastic for light elements like oxygen, sulfur, and chlorine, but it won't tell me what they're bound to. And the TEM EDX, the SEM didn't have enough resolution, and the TEM EDX does, and EDX is quite good for looking at heavier elements. So in this case, I wanted to see whether or not the sulfur was bound to hafnium, because in the literature it was reported that hafnium was a good sulfur scavenger, but also titanium and chromium. So in this case, I was able to show that these particles at the grain boundaries are titanium and chromium rich, and they're sulfides. Yes, sulfur overlaps with molybdenum even here, but between the SIMS and the TEM, this is very convincing evidence that those are sulfides. And the hafnium and tantalum formed oxides with a bit of zirconium in them as well. So in this case, and these are the bright particles that we observe here, whereas sulfides are the dark ones. So now I got a bigger picture of everything that's going on. I want to get an explanation for this. So obviously until now I've just been looking at secondary cracks. To double check that everything that I have done applies to the primary crack, I got an interrupted test. So this is the notch, and there's the crack going in. And just looking at an interrupted test, just to make sure that everything that we have done is representative of the primary crack that propagated to failure, because the secondary cracks could have stayed there for hours. So we're not quite sure if those are representative or if these reactions happened later. But looking at an interrupted test, this all made a lot of sense because this is exactly, we're observing the exact same thing that we observed in the secondary cracks. So there is some chromia and some nickel oxide, a whole variety of different oxides, some titanium oxide in the crack, and some alumina all around. And then sulfur and molybdenum form all these dark particles that look exactly like the ones around the secondary crack at the grain boundaries around the primary crack. So this was from the middle of the primary crack. At the very edge of it, what I got is alumina. Actually, there's no evidence of sulfides forming. So this looks like the crack initially propagates through a mechanism of formation of chromium titanium mixed sulfides that then oxidized as the crack goes ahead, and that's why we detect these chromium titanium oxides within the oxide in the crack. And then the sulfur is released and can go ahead and form other sulfides ahead of the crack tip and keep embrittling it. But at one point, you kind of run out of sulfur. So in this case, the salt was applied through a pipette in the notch directly, and we didn't reapply it throughout the test. So at this point, the propagation appears to have switched to a different mode, which seems to be mostly alumina driven. So at one point it stops being corrosion driven and sulfur driven and switches to a bit more oxygen driven. So that's the kind of information that you can get from looking at the atom probe. But like I said, we need a whole background of a variety of other techniques to back up. And then the atom probe is the very final thing that gives you the answer. So we need to be able to ask the right question by looking at this in TEM and SEM and all the other techniques first, and then get to the atom probe. I want to give another example of surface contamination. This is a project that we did with Good Fabrications performance exhausts. And in this case, this is an Inconel 625 Formula One exhaust pipe that cracked in service, and they wanted to figure out why. So we got sent a piece, and the first characterization looking at Inconel 625, there were these cracked lines of nitrides. So you can already tell that maybe one of the vacuum furnaces is not under great vacuum anymore. But apart from that, there were some carbides, and it's quite important to see that niobium and carbon are in the carbides, but titanium is not. So by looking at, obviously, this is the kind of sample where we know that it was used in service, but they don't have thermocouples and a good full thermal history to give us for this sample the same way that we would if we put it in a furnace of our own. So we kind of have to figure out from the evolution of the nitrides and carbides what the thermal history of the sample is. And just by looking at these, there are titanium nitrides that contain very little niobium and niobium carbides that contain no titanium. So this is the starting point. And but obviously EDX is not very accurate for quantifying niobium and carbon. So I did some atom probe on this, so cantilever. And these are the markers that were placed over the nitrides to get a composition of the nitrides. And just by picking that up and analyzing it in the atom probe, what we got is exactly what I just mentioned. So titanium and nitrogen. The nitrides have a little bit of carbon, but the niobium is primarily in the bulk alloy and in the carbides, not in the nitrides. So this is the composition that we got. And then, yeah, there's a bit of sample preparation, but I've gone through it and shown how it works with the crack tip before. So I'm not going to go through it again. And in this case, we have a before and after. So they gave us a piece of Inconel 625 before use, and there was already these lines of nitrides, and then you can see the surface didn't have an oxide scale. After use, there are still these lines of nitrides, of like broken up blocky nitrides, but there are suddenly a lot of precipitates at every grain boundary, and then on the surface, there's a scale that formed. So we need to figure out what happened and what the evolution of this is. So this is just a 3D fib slicing going through the sample, looking at the surface scale. We can see that some voids have formed underneath the surface, but the scale is relatively continuous, and it doesn't look like any of the corrosion products have broken through or any of the oxide scale has fallen off, which is quite interesting. To characterize something like this, I need a lot of different techniques as well, because like I mentioned before, some of them are better for light elements and some of them are better for heavy elements. So this is the surface scale, and there's the nickel is the bulk alloy. At the boundary, there's some niobium, some calcium, some zinc, phosphorus, potassium, and it's quite interesting. The surface deposit doesn't look like it's broken through. So we kind of got this sample thinking that it was going to be a corrosion failure, but we can see a deposit on the surface, but it doesn't look like the deposit has broken through. And through EPMA, looking at the inner surface and comparing it to the outer surface, this is quite interesting because it allows us to compare two samples that have had the exact same thermal history, although we don't know the exact thermal history, but we know that it's going to be more or less the same, since the overall thickness was about 5 millimeters. But one side has been exposed to fuel and the other one has not. So both of them have an oxide scale on the surface. So there's some chromia that has formed, as you would expect on Inconel 625. There are some alumina intrusions underneath. Niobium, titanium are now both in the same particle here, and there are these molybdenum and silicon-rich precipitates at the grain boundaries. And this is the outer scale. The inner one is very similar, actually. It doesn't necessarily look like it. The scale bar is very different. It's much thicker, but the chromia scale is continuous on the surface. There are some alumina intrusions underneath, and then there's a deposit on the surface. Niobium and titanium are segregating to the same location, and there are these silicon-rich, molybdenum-rich precipitates all around as well. So it's actually very, very similar, except that the inner surface has a much thicker scale and a deposit. And that's why I was saying before with the EDX. In EPMA, we have to know in advance what elements to look for. So these are not necessarily elements that we were expecting in the alloy. It doesn't contain zinc, phosphorus, or potassium or calcium. So we didn't really go looking for them. But EDX kind of helped us take a bit more comprehensive, non-quantitative overview at the surface and figure out what was the thickness of that scale. Because in the EPMA, you can see there's a lot of oxygen, but all the other elements we were expecting were not there. So in the atom probe, we picked up two different sections. We found some chromia on the surface. We found some niobium oxide as well, which is quite interesting. It proves, it follows on from the EPMA at showing that actually there is some continuous chromia scale on the surface. So that's quite interesting proof of that. But then the XRD showed us, the XRD in this case gave us a bit more of a solution to the problem. So on the outer surface, so this is comparing the outer surface on the left with the inner surface on the right. And we have the same sort of matrix superalloy, some delta phase precipitation, chromia, the nickel chrome spinel as expected. But on the inner surface, we have something that's a fuel additive. So it's actually a deposit of a fuel additive that built up on the surface. And it's the zinc S6PO3R, where R is like a long chain of hydrocarbons. And we were able to detect that on the surface from the whole combination of techniques. And so XRD confirmed the crystal structure, but the rest also confirmed the composition. And we couldn't have guessed what that was just based on the XRD database without a better idea from the EDX of what elements we were looking for in that scale. So at this stage, what we have shown is actually that wasn't a corrosion failure at all. There's a surface scale that is continuous and protective. One of the samples has a deposit of a fuel additive on top of it, but it hasn't broken through. So at that point, we started looking at these nitrides. And the nitrides now, they're titanium and niobium rich and nitrogen. So, and then all around it at the grain boundary, there's these silicon molybdenum rich phases. And this was not a single occurrence. This was happening throughout the entire sample. So all of the nitrides, they went from initially being just titanium rich to now being titanium and niobium rich. And that composition was proved by atom probe. So at this stage, EDX, we have, as I said, an idea of where the elements are going, but atom probe is giving us a quantitative amount. And now we can show that if niobium is this orange one and the nitride is on the right, we can see that this is a titanium nitride that has a lot of niobium now in solid solution, whereas beforehand it didn't. The other interesting thing that we saw is that all of the dislocations within the nitride were very, very chromium rich. So all of these lines that we can see in the nitride are chromium rich dislocations. So that's a sign of the initial dissolution of the nitrides. And evolution of the composition. So this must have happened above 1,000 degrees. So we can tell that they've pushed in Canal 625 above 1,000 degrees, which is not really certified to go to that kind of temperatures. And that's the conclusion of that work. So from this, we've shown that actually this wasn't a corrosion failure at all. It was just pushing it beyond the kind of temperature that it needed to go to. And through the combination of characterization techniques, we were able to show that the surface deposit did not break through the oxide scale, but from the evolution of the nitrides, we could tell that we went a bit beyond where we should have gone. I'm going to quickly touch on some titanium and atom probe for titanium at the end now, just because this is, I'm not going to be talking about corrosion, but it's quite important for looking at impurities, and especially impurities at things like grain boundaries and dislocations. And with the new setup, with the new cryogenic setup, we're going to be able to do a lot more of that, because we can be sure that we're not introducing hydrides in the fib, for example, or during the sample preparation. So it's going to really, really help us work on titanium and the location of oxygen and hydrogen in particular in titanium. I want to work on corrosion as well, and this is part of what I'm showing today is part of a project on corrosion, but specifically with the new atom probe setup, I'm going to be able to look at a bit more the location of oxygen and hydrogen in the atom probe. So in this case, we got some samples that were 3D printed Ti-64 on a heated powder bed, and the powder bed temperature was so we got several of them made at 100 degrees, and then we got several different temperatures. The peak ductility was achieved. So this is from a tensile test, elongation to failure. The first sample at 100 degrees had some ductility. Up all the way up to 570, ductility went up, and at 770, the ductility was 0, and the sample was as brittle as it gets. It was just basically failing like a ceramic. And the UTS was, you can see the exact same thing at 770. It just went all the way down, which was quite interesting. We wanted to do this because it's, if you heat treat them afterwards, you can have a two-step. You can 3D print the sample and then heat treat it later. But if you can skip the middle step, we figured it would be quicker. But actually, it produced some very, very interesting results. So the porosity was more or less the same. We quantified the porosity, and all three samples, 100, 570, and 770, the three more interesting samples, with some ductility, a lot more, and then 0 ductility, were quite similar in porosity, so both in pore size and distribution. And these are fracture surfaces from the samples as well. In XRD, we showed that there are alpha, alpha prime, and beta phases in almost all of them. We could not really detect beta in the one at 100 degrees, not through XRD, at least. So through EBSD, just looking at it, we got some beta phase in the sample at 100 degrees. So this is 100, this is 570, and this is 770. The morphology, oh, I'm sorry that this is, it looks quite pixelated to me. This is quite annoying, but I put a link to the actual paper in the, like 2 slides ago. So if that's of interest, I can send a non-pixelated image or a non-compressed image to anyone who wants it, or you can find it on the paper. But basically looking at the texture with EBSD, there was a substantial change in texture, yes. The amount of alpha and beta, I mean, most of these are alpha. When we phase mapped, we could detect some beta phase in all of them, so maybe it was not enough for the XRD to pick it up, but the EBSD certainly did. But what was extra interesting about this is the picture at the top left is the sample at 100. So I'm pointing at it with the cursor, and it's very heavily twinned, this sample. So this is a TEM sample, electropolished, and all of them were cut in the same direction, which is perpendicular to the printing direction. And there are a lot of twins that have formed in the sample at 100. The sample below, so the bottom left, is the sample at 570. We can't see any twins there, but we can see a lot of dislocations. And they are just very entangled and mixed. They're not as, for lack of a better word, structured as the 770 sample. So both the top and bottom pictures from the right are at 770, and you can see all these dislocation structures, but they look cross-slipped. They look very, very directional on specific lattice planes. And you can see that these dislocations, yeah, they're clearly following specific lattice planes. And looking at them, where they intersect, there are these particles as well that have formed that are beta particles. So in this case, looking at the 3 different samples, we can already tell that there's a huge difference between them. Now, the next thing to do was to, well, for one thing, look at oxygen content. I think all the titanium metallurgists out there are probably cringing looking at this line, the oxygen content, and thinking that this is enough to explain the bristleness. It probably is, but the only brittle sample here was the 770. The 100 degree sample could still accommodate 0.5% oxygen and have some ductility, and the 570 degree sample could accommodate 0.7% oxygen and have some ductility. So I'm quite surprised at that as well. Clearly, the oxygen uptake has been increased quite a lot by 3D printing at temperature. But yeah, this is quite interesting. And then at 770, we've upped the oxygen content so much that, well, clearly there's no more ductility. Also, the dislocations don't look like they could be moving. So they're very entangled and very, well, they look cross-lipped to me, but it's quite hard to tell. So at 100 degrees, looking at the twins that were there, we can see an excess of titanium and a reduction of aluminium and a bit of vanadium at the twin boundaries. So this is quite interesting. There is some segregation at the twin boundaries. At 570, clearly we've dissolved the twins. We've got rid of them through heat treatment at higher temperature. And looking at the dislocations here, we see the same type of segregation. So this, looking through here, we see the same kind of thing of like excess vanadium and titanium depletion. And at 770, there's still some evidence of this. So the dislocations are still enriched in vanadium, but they don't look mobile anymore, and the sample is failing in an extremely brittle manner. After this study, I had a student who did thermodynamic predictions and calculations about whether or not there was sufficient vanadium going to the dislocations to nucleate beta there. Through thermodynamic predictions, she was able to show that no, not really. And we didn't also detect any specific oxygen increase at dislocations, which is quite interesting. So in this case, we can tell that at 100 degrees, so we can see here the overall oxygen content is quite high, but at 100 degrees and 570, there's still ductility, and at 770 there isn't. So there's clearly a different mechanism that's causing the embrittlement. And it's interesting that at 100 degrees, the stresses from 3D printing manifest in twins, that then at 570 are no longer present, but then there are a lot of a very high dislocation density, and the dislocations that contain a high vanadium content, but no particular oxygen content. And then at 770, these dislocations no longer look like they're mobile. So this is the conclusion that we've reached from this study. It's quite interesting. Definitely want to continue it further. I have a student who's been modeling this from a thermodynamic perspective, but I was looking at her work about 20 minutes before starting the seminar, so didn't really have time to add this into the seminar. But if anyone has suggestions as to what could be happening in this sample, I'm all ears. And I would like to thank a lot of people for all their help, including EPSRC, who funded my fellowship on corrosion and oxidation and the Atom Probe bid. And then a couple of these were Rolls-Royce projects, good fabrications as well. And the titanium work was not industry funded at all. So yeah, thanks. Thanks for listening. Does anyone have questions?
Excellent. Thank you very much, Stella. That was great. Going to give you a clap and presume everyone else's as well. So thank you very much. Yeah, I'd just like to say that was an excellent presentation, and also an excellent illustration of why it's important to do complementary characterization techniques, and you can't just do one. So yeah, excellent. And yeah, and just exciting news about the Atom Probe bid as well. So that's really good. Yeah, and the sort of cryogenic capability, I think it sounds like you can